Today's webinar is on collective leadership, the goal, not the role, and it's being led by colleagues Carolyn Jackson and Sean Cardiff, with contributions from other colleagues as well into the webinar. During the webinar, please can we ask you that you post any comments or questions in the comment box, and we will then pose those questions to our speakers for today. So without any further ado, let me hand you over to Carrie and Sean.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. A very warm welcome to our audience. I understand we've got colleagues joining us today from across the UK and some of our colleagues in Europe, so it's really great to have you all here. Our focus today is going to be on collective leadership, the goal, not the role. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome Sean Cardiff to co-facilitate this session with me. I've known Sean since the late 1980s when we worked together in the intensive care unit and high dependency cardiothoracic units at the Middlesex Hospital in London, which no longer exists. Sean has worked in the Netherlands since 1991. He's a senior lecturer in the Knowledge Centre in the School of People and Applied Healthcare Studies at Fontys University of Applied Sciences. Held a former visiting appointment with the England Centre for Practice Development and is an active member of the International Practice Development Collaborative. His real interests are in person-centred leadership, participatory action research and culture change, and he's published some papers with us in those particular themes in the last few years. And we worked recently together on a 2Cs EU Interreg project, developing new models of care for people living with dementia, which was called the Cascade Project. So over to you, Sean.
Yes, thank you, Carrie. And Carrie Jackson, as you may well or may not know, is currently director of the Impact Research Group, which are based at the University of East Anglia in Norwich in the UK. And as Carrie said, we initially met way back in the 1980s in that wonderful Middlesex Hospital, which unfortunately no longer exists, and reunited again. I think it was in the middle of the 2005 somewhere, when you started up the English Centre for Practice Development and were part of the IPDC group again. And since then, we've obviously met through that international network, and really interesting following your development now as you've worked through different projects in the English Centre and published. And we've got close ideas around what leadership is and should be, and how that should be influencing current day practice. And there's some of the thoughts that we'd like to share with everyone today. So I think it's time really to move on to our next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Thanks, Rebecca. We've got some invited guests with us today. So we're going to be hearing from Professor Kim Manley on multi-professional clinical leadership and the new consultant practitioner framework. We're going to be hearing from Ian Setchfield, who is an acute care nurse consultant with East Kent Hospitals University Foundation Trust. He's created a film for us on his personal impact journey as a clinical systems leader, and we're going to be sharing that on our YouTube channel and through our live tweeting chat after this event. And then I'm delighted also to welcome Helen Stanley, who's Associate Tutor in the School of Health Sciences at the University of Surrey and former Head of Department at the University of Brighton for Continuing Professional Development. She's completing her PhD at the moment, doing a realist evaluation to look at the impact of a clinical leadership programme in the southeast of England. And a very big thank you to our wider impact team, Jonathan for introducing us, Sally for facilitating the web chat, and to Heather, Rebecca and Bianca, whose support we couldn't ever do without. So thank you. Rebecca, next slide, please. So our webinar today aims to look at, firstly, what leadership means to you. And we're going to be doing an activity in a moment. But we really want to focus on collective leadership and why it's important, particularly in the context of a COVID world. And we're going to today be exploring 3 studies in particular that provide insight into contemporary leadership theory. And that's really important because it is the evidence base for the Venus model for person-centered sustainable transformation. I've mentioned Ian's journey, which you'll be able to see as a systems leader on video afterwards. And we will be linking this back to the other stems of the Venus model, because leadership is affected by culture and context, and also facilitation skills of leaders. It's important to say that we've chosen to take this really strong theoretical lens because we want to build a foundation for Venus. And that is really important because it will become a future workforce transformation model in the east of England, and we're hoping nationally and internationally. We've also chosen this theme because leadership publications to date are largely atheoretical, and there is no evidence of longitudinal return on investment or impact on sustainable change through any of the large-scale research evaluations that have been done in the UK on leadership. So it's really important that we have a common understanding of what works from contemporary research to build new knowledge and insight, and understand the context of leadership within the Venus model and the other integrated skill sets, so that we're able to actually lead at scale. And in our next webinar series, which starts in May, we will be exploring much more practical application of how leaders can demonstrate and evidence their impact in the workplace. Next slide, please. So we're going to invite you to undertake an activity with us to address the question, what does leadership mean to you? Because we'd like to find out what your understanding of the concept is. So if you could type in, please, the menti.com address and then insert the code 587000, it will take you through to 2 questions. So we'd ask you to have a look at this question to see which image resonates with your understanding of leadership. And then to identify for you, place a vote. And then we'll move into some analysis. Jonathan's going to do a bit of commentary on the slides for us. So we'll just give you a couple of minutes.
Okay, so thanks, Carrie. So what we can see with what resonates to people is how some people are seeing all those attributes as being key to sort of leadership roles, which is 46% of people. And then we have a sort of breakdown as to single items related to how people are assessing their own leadership, starting from leading from the front, leading as a dance. And as Sally has commented, that's a lovely metaphor, I think, about leadership being a dance. Leadership is flying in formation, and leadership is bridging the gap.
That's great. Can we go on to the next slide, Rebecca? There's one more question for participants to address. So this one asks you, is leadership more of A, B, C, D, or all? And again, we just invite you to make a choice and vote, please.
So the votes are coming in, or the self-assessment is coming in from people. I want to say it's a bit like the Eurovision Song Contest.
Just a bit.
Oh, don't worry, I'm not going to start singing. So what we can see is the highest number so far that people have assessed against is all, but also identification of leadership as being a natural talent, something that emerges between people, practice, something you exercise, and D is a role/job.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you very much, everybody. I think we will be picking up some of the themes in relation to is leadership a job or a role or something else in just a moment when we go back to the slides. So Rebecca, if you could please take us back to the slides. Thank you. And we'll go to the next slide, please. So we are presenting today on the premise that anybody can be a leader of something, because leadership is both a practice and a way of being. So if you look at the square at the top of the slide, great leaders don't set out to be a leader, they set out to make a difference. So for us, it's never about the role, it's always about the goal. And that's quite important, because lots of people with leadership job titles are called leaders, but they don't necessarily have the skill set to lead well or enable others. And we've used the metaphor here of the eagle because eagles have a powerful vision, they're fearless, they're high flyers, and they nurture, most importantly, their young. But they also focus on detail, the here and now, and make it happen, which is very important. But for us, when we're talking about leadership, we're talking about transformational leadership, and that's underpinned by person-centered values that focus on getting the best out of others. And the sorts of behaviors that you would see from a transformational leader would be somebody who can model the way, inspire a shared vision, challenge processes when they're not quite right, but most importantly, enable others to act, and encouraging other people's interests, heart and passions. Next slide, please. And it's really important that we develop the capacity and capability of these sorts of leaders at scale, so that we can enable and empower each other to be the best that we can be, so that we're not just investing in the leadership development of one person, but we're focusing on the collective leadership and strengths of the team. And this slide shows this quote by Phil Jackson, which I think is really powerful. The strength of the team is each individual member, and the strength of each member is the team. So getting the best out of each other and playing to each other's strengths and interests, focusing on what matters most, is really important, with people working to a common vision and goals. And it's very important, however, that we do think about leadership as being context bound. So the workplace and organisational culture, the values and power structures, leadership approaches and styles, and human relationships and dynamics within the workplace all impact on our ability to lead well and nurture others. So it's important to note that leadership cannot be considered in a vacuum. So we have to always think about and attend to culture, context, values and beliefs. But we want to try to create cultures that enable person-centered leadership, with a focus on those important practice development principles as ways of working, which is collaboration, inclusion, participation, so that we can enable people to flourish. And in a little bit, you're going to hear about some research that's been undertaken by both Sean and Helen that develop that concept a bit further. Next slide, please. So how would we actually recognise a high-performing team? Well, on the right-hand side here, you can see that we would expect a team to have role clarity, shared vision and objectives, a shared governance structure, and that they'd be learning, developing and improving by learning from each other. There would be a culture of learning. A propensity to take risks, but also high challenge and high support. That is, we are trying to get the best out of each other and using supportive ways to give and receive feedback. But there's a real focus on getting things done effectively. But underpinning all of that, there has to be psychological safety. And this grid shows you the impact of what happens when you have it within your workplace context and when you don't. So teams that have psychological safety see mistakes as opportunities to learn. They're willing to take risks and fail collectively together. They are not afraid to speak up and openly share their struggles. And they have a high degree of trust in their teammates and supervisors and are not scared to stick their neck out. That's really important to understand in the context of existing and future integrated health and care systems, because actually now in the new plans for integrated care, we're bringing lots of people together that haven't previously worked together from interdependent organisations. And there is a requirement and a focus on rapid transformation in health and social care services to meet citizens' needs. So not only do we have to get used to developing new relationships with colleagues, but we also have the challenge of needing to wrap services around citizens so that we can meet population health needs and deliver place-based models of care. So all of that is going to be very challenging to develop the sorts of teams with the skill sets that will enable that vision to be achieved. We have to break down the silos of existing ways of doing things and focus on enabling citizens and communities to have a stronger voice in influencing service commissioning and delivery. And that requires positive person-centered relationships. But we wanted to talk briefly about what we've noticed about leadership in the time of COVID. So Rebecca, if you go to the next slide for me, please. The COVID context has really challenged our ways of working and our ability to adapt and our resilience and so much more. So we thought we'd just share some brief insights from research and experience that we've had with frontline practitioners. So first off, I'm going to invite Sean just to tell you a bit about what he's noticed has happened within the Netherlands. Thanks, Sean. Next slide, please, Rebecca. Sean, do we have you there?
It would help if I didn't mute myself. That's why I was thinking, Rebecca, you're a bit slow today, but she's obviously not slow. She just couldn't hear me. It's the European delay. We'll say it's the Brexit is causing the delay. At Fontes, we have a Bachelor Management in Healthcare and Health and Social Care program. These students are mature students, so they've already had a professional education in one of the healthcare professions or the social care professions, and are then wanting to develop their management and leadership skills for other posts that they may be aspiring to. And many of them are in roles such as team leaders, charge nurses, junior managers within health and social care organisations. And in the leadership programme, which runs through the whole of the bachelor programme, there is a lot of sharing around and a lot of discovery work being done about what is leadership. So we don't tell people what leadership is, we let them discover it and create their own visions. And during that storytelling, could you click please, Rebecca? We were noticing a lot of really good, aspiring and interesting stories coming through about fostering autonomy, especially self-direction, which was a big movement, or is still a big movement in the Netherlands, self-directed teams, and about the importance of participation. And in terms of leadership styles, most of them were inspired by transformational leadership, the several models therefore, servant leadership from Greenfield, situational leadership, which is quite old but still relevant, and authentic leadership. Another click, please. So, and then COVID arrived last year, and another click, please. And stories started to change, and we started to hear about, oh, we've had to revert back to the commando structure. And the commando structure felt initially quite alien to me, and thinking, oh, what's happening here? Another click, please. So I started to question, well, why is this change in narrative from these wonderful transformational servant leaders, and suddenly there's a commando, which was bringing up this imagery of a militant type style, almost autocratic. And it was only when we started to unpick that a bit more that it suddenly became more, theoretically, you could start to understand why. Another click, please. And if we use Dreyfus model, or we use Benner's model of the novice to expert, what was happening was suddenly these leaders were no longer competent or proficient in this new situation. So they're actually falling back to a lower level of expertise, and they're becoming novices in a COVID situation, leading in COVID, or advanced beginners. And what is characteristic when you're at that level is that you hunker for guidelines, you hunker for direction, because that will give you some sense of security. So it really was not surprising that this change back to a commando structure and decision making was accepted very readily. And then as we come out of COVID again, there is lots of realization and stories around there are certain aspects we want to keep hold of, that willingness to work together, that camaraderie, and also not always challenging everything. But then it then also begins, new questions start to be arised of, well, do we want a more vertical leadership, or do we want to move towards a more horizontal leadership? So we can move on to the next slide, please. And that's where the idea of this collective leadership becomes quite important, especially if we're talking around self-directed teams, which is basically what happens in the Dutch phenomenon of buurtzorg for community nursing. So you have to really look at that leadership, and that's why we've done the Mentimeter at the beginning. What does it mean? Because depending on where you're standing, it could mean different things to different people. As you can see, you know, two people looking at a number on the ground, and one saying it's a 6 and the other one saying it's a 9. So although the premise is everybody can be a leader of something, but their influence will be greater if they are more self-aware and have a good vision about what they actually mean by everyone can be a leader. So next tick, please. So we've got some critical questions that you may like to ask yourself or discuss with other people when you're talking about leadership in the future, that could help this enlightenment of what are we actually talking about. And those questions are, well, what am I leading? And who am I leading? Where do I want to lead them towards? Where do I want to why do I want to lead them there? And how am I going to lead them? And how will I know if this has made an impact? The question that is most often talked about, or the answer that's most often given, the question that's given the most attention usually when talking about leadership, is the how. And yet we're starting to realize more and more that the what, the who, and the where, and the why are equally, if not more important, before you start discussing how. And if you could tick, please. Because basically leadership is about awareness and focus. So you have to be aware and focused on what you're leading. It's also about relationships. You can't lead nobody. You have to lead somebody. So you're automatically in a relationship. So who you are leading is important to know that. It's also about creating and working towards a shared vision, which is extremely important to kind of the collective leadership. So that's where do I want to lead them towards. And the why is important because leadership is also a moral and an ethical practice. You are affecting people, you're affecting their working lives, and how you affect them will have an impact on their work, for instance, the care that they give. And the last is the how. Well, leadership is about action, it's about thinking and doing. It's not just about doing and tasks, it's also about the thinking. And so how will I know if I've made an impact is, well, you have to achieve something if you're leading. Otherwise, what's the idea of engaging in leadership? So there's some interesting questions, and it's something I've noticed as well. I'm starting to pose it more and more with students who are talking around leadership, especially when they say everyone can be a leader of something, but then they'll choose someone and then it starts to become difficult. Well, why are they a leader? And then actually articulating that can sometimes be quite difficult. So the next slide, please. And I think now we're moving back to Carrie. Carrie, is your mic on?
Thank you, Sean. Thinking about the local context for learning from COVID, we were very fortunate to have worked in partnership with Norfolk and Waveney Health and Care Partnership in September, just after we came into post. And we helped to evaluate the We Care Together campaign, which they ran between April and August 2020. And we looked at 176 transcripts of interviews with frontline health and care workers from acute primary care home sectors, and that represented all healthcare professionals, gardeners, domestic operatives, porters, technicians, pharmacists, you name it. And what they wanted us to do with the project was to identify lessons to be learned from the oral living history of frontline staff's experience of the first wave. The second was to develop a baseline from which the Health and Care Partnership could develop its workforce. And the third was to develop insights for service sustainability. And from the 176 transcripts that we looked at of interviews, we identified 31 themes. And those findings were presented in a report, and you can see at the bottom of this slide, there's this paper has actually been published, so you can read about this in detail at your leisure. But the findings were presented as things that went well compared to those that didn't, the challenges compared with celebrations and outcomes, the learning and insights gained, and impact on roles. But most importantly, we were able to distill from those themes 4 tentative program theories about system transformation from the data. And the first is about being person-centered. So we were able to identify that contexts that live person-centered, compassionate values and see the person both in the patient and in each other are really, really important to both professional and personal well-being, and are really crucial to supporting resilience amongst staff, patients and their families. So if we're able to live person-centered values in our practice, then we can cope with all the challenges that are thrown at us. The second important program theory was teamwork and cross-boundary working, and there was great evidence of innovation of people working together in very different contexts in teams that they hadn't usually worked with, and adapting services in order to meet the demands, and that has continued through the second wave. But here we were able to identify that effective workplace contexts where there's good teamwork and cross-boundary relationships and working meant that there was a greater opportunity in ideas and innovations for change being implemented, and everyone feeling valued on that journey. And that's really important to becoming effective and high-performing teams, and enable people to feel as though they could adapt to the challenges that they faced. So that was a crucial theme. The third and fourth themes were about how the system learns about the infrastructure and the processes that it needs to put in place to enable teams to be effective. And that includes clear, consistent communication, clarity of guidance and policies, and also making sure that it has good business principles that underpin the future direction. So most importantly, sustaining learning from new ways of working will help the workforce to think about having the right skills in the right place at the right time to deliver the right care to meet population needs. And that is really important going forwards as we're tackling long COVID. So next slide, please. So with that in mind, what we wanted to do now was to look at contemporary research about leadership through 3 different lenses. So we're going to be looking from an individual person-centered perspective. We're then going to look at research around teams, and then we'll move into research and development around collective leadership and clinical systems leadership. So first of all, I'd like to hand back, if I may, to Sean who's going to take you through his PhD research, which focused on the theory of person-centered leadership. Thanks, Rebecca.
Next slide. Oh, yeah, great. So I have a background being educated in the UK, in London, in nursing. And during my early career, I was always struck by how much impact that leaders and their leadership was having on my working life. And when I moved to the Netherlands, after working in practice, I moved into higher education and was a member of the Knowledge Centre. And there we were working with the Paris framework for evidence-based practice. And in that framework, which talks about using multiple forms of evidence to influence the care that is given, but also realize that context was extremely important and that culture and leadership were key influences of the way evidence was being used in practice, and that the whole could be and should be facilitated by skilled facilitators. So then we were talking also in practice development that one of the major things in practice development was about being person-centered and trying to ensure that the care that was given was person-centered care. And at that time, Brendan McCormack and Tanya McCarthy's framework for person-centered nursing was what I was became accustomed to and was working with, which then led me to think about, well, if we're trying to develop and person-centered care, what does that say about the leadership and the leaders who are leading that care? And I'm thinking, well, shouldn't that also be person-centered? But at that moment in time, there wasn't really the literature, and it wasn't really a concept that was talked about. So that set me off on my PhD journey in a geriatric unit in an acute hospital in the Netherlands, working initially with charge nurses and the unit manager, but then expanding that to primary nurses once they changed the nursing system, to look at the way they were leading care and whether that could be classed as person-centered and why it was then person-centered. And the outcome of that was a conceptual framework for person-centered leadership. So the next slide, please. So I won't really talk about the research journey itself, but more of the conceptual framework. Now, I do realize when people first see this for the first time, they think, whoa, there's a lot in there. So it has to be broken down in stages so you can understand it better understand it. And that breaking down does take a little while, but the figure itself is explicitly round to show that leadership is a continuous process. And what you'll notice as well is a black stippled line between a blue area and an orange yellow area. And basically that is to demonstrate that in leadership, it's a relational phenomenon, but that relationship is also affected by the environment, the context around those people in that leadership relationship. So would you like to tick for me, please, Rebecca? Okay, so in person-centered leadership, what we found was the main focus of the leader was enabling people to come into their own, but also enabling self to come into their own. That's what you were aiming towards. So this was slightly different from previous leadership styles that were more focused on organizational outcomes of realizing the organizational vision. This made it all more personal. And so they were talking about people coming into their own. And what they meant by that is that they had a sense of well-being in the workplace and from their work, and that they felt empowered to do their work to the best of their ability, which was the self-actualization. So, and that empowerment was not just having access to the resources they needed to perform well, but also the belief in their own ability and feeling supported to do that. So you had structural and psychological empowerment. And all of this gave a sense that people were willing to develop, they were developing themselves, and had a sense that they were reaching their full potential. And it was through that they were able to contribute to the other outcomes, the organizational outcomes, the patient outcomes, etc., etc. Another tick, please. So what does that really involve? So there were certain relational processes that we discovered, and those are named in that purple and yellowy, greeny ring around that coming into own. And what we found was that the leaders were using all of their senses to gain a sense of where is the people or the person I'm leading at this moment in time. So using their ears and their eyes and also their personal feelings, but also being careful to verify their interpretations before they actually took action. It was also around balancing needs, balancing your own need as a leader and balancing the needs of the person you are leading, but also in terms of the context, balancing the needs of other stakeholders. So what happens in that leadership relationship will not only affect the leader and the associate, as we called it, rather than follower, but also other people around. So this complexity was very evident. Contextualizing was very much associated with the person-centered as well, because each person in their work context is more than just a professional. They are also a mother, they are also a chairperson of a hobby club or whatever, and they inhabit different contexts outside of the work environment. And those contexts and the experiences can also influence how they are within the working environment. So seeing the whole person was extremely important, and not just seeing them as a professional, but really first seeing them as a person. The process of presencing is quite common and quite well documented in the nursing literature, but not so much in the leadership literature when it is meant in terms of being present or being sympathetically present towards the other person. And we found that that was also important, that aided that relational connectedness from which that coming into own could grow. And communing was the last process, and communing was the action-orientated dialogue. So where dialogue is about trying to understand each other and your own perspectives and your standing points, communing was finding each other. So sometimes if there was a disagreement, actually the conversation needed to carry on in the dialogue and understand each other until you reach a point where you both find each other and agree, this is what we want to work to, and then to move from that moment in time. So another click, please, Rebecca. So those processes gave the leaders a lot of information around the other person, the people they were leading, and also about how best to position themselves in that relationship. And that's what we meant by the stancing. So, and there were 4 stances that were identified. There was the leading from the front, the sideline, alongside, and behind. Leading from the front was inviting, not telling, and not being forcing, that you would role model something. So that's sometimes leading from the front was relevant. Leading from alongside was inviting to offer instruction or help from a distance so that somebody could actually do something themselves. And leading from alongside was more in tune with that high challenge and high support. So quite a close moment in the relationship where the leader would be encouraging and supporting someone to come into action. And leading from behind was taking a step back. And that taking that step back was sometimes in terms of delegation, so to speak, letting people do what you've asked them to do or what they wanted to do, etc. But sometimes it was also around creating a learning space. So stepping back and being observant how they were actually performing and how they were actually practicing. Because from that point, then the stance could change quite readily so that the stancing of the leader would be more appropriate. So once again, fed by what the leader was sensing, the balancing of needs, etc., etc. And always with the aim of what am I doing and how do I enable this person and myself both to come into our own. Another click, please. The contextual factors. So there were various factors that were influencing these leadership relationships, and they were obviously stakeholder needs of other people, because as the team grew and the leadership grew, that had an influence on other stakeholders, such as the medical team. The safe, critical and creative communicative spaces were important because they were created and in which people could explore leadership, but also where they want to move to for that shared visioning. And the systems of evaluation, obviously when they evaluated the leadership, it would affect how people were leading, but also the way people leading were fed back into evaluation systems and manifest in other things like the culture, the workplace culture. There were changes in the workplace culture. And the organisational culture was another factor that could positively and sometimes negatively influence what was happening in this leadership development, particularly when there was more traditional hierarchical and strong hierarchical and almost autocratic approach to leadership within the organisation, and yet this unit was transforming. But gradually they started to influence the rest of the organisation and other leaders within the organisation. So there was once again this reciprocal influencing between context and the leadership relationship. So the next slide, please. Certain characteristics were evident, and that was around being authentically other-centered, and that needs to be authentic because people will certainly know if you're not really other-centered or person-centered. And also caring, so leaders do also need to be caring towards the personnel, and especially in this time when such shortages of staff, we need to be really take care of our staff to make sure we still have the workforce to deliver the care we want to deliver. It means that you have to have intelligence around yourself and how you are in relationships, but also what happens in relationships, and be able to read situations and other people. So the emotional intelligence is in there as well. It takes patience. Sometimes the leaders are quite aspirational and they see something they want to achieve, but they have to remember that they work with people and not just drag them along behind them. And optimism was also quite effective in keeping the atmosphere good. And as well as being open to what's happening around you, plus the feedback you were getting. And it wasn't always positive, but welcoming that, and especially asking for feedback was more important than giving feedback. So by asking feedback a lot and first, you actually created the atmosphere and the culture in which feedback could be readily shared. And although some leaders initially had the idea they had to be, in Dutch we say the rots in the brand, in that rock in the tide, in the flush of the waves, leaders also need to be able to show their own vulnerability, that they too are human and do not know everything, so that they can receive that support from the people they're leaving, so that both can really come into their own and reach their full potential. And all of this obviously means that leaders have to be aware of what influence they are having on the other person in the relationship and the context around them. So the next slide, please. So we applied that framework not in a healthcare setting after my PhD, but in an educational setting. And this is where leadership is not restricted to healthcare practitioners, but it should also be infiltrating the whole of our education system as well. So as educators, we started to look at, well, how are we going to lead learning groups? What are we leading? That's their education in leadership. Who are we leading? They were their students. Where do you want to lead them to? We wanted them to actually come into their own and develop their own vision of good leadership. Why? Because that's important. We don't want to have there's only one way to lead kind of culture, that there should be, people should be able to lead to the best of their ability. So the next tick, please. So the learners embark on their own personal journey, and they're actually accompanied by the lecturer who is leading the learning group as a whole. The next tick, please. And this fitted in with the current culture of this self-directedness in healthcare and self-directed teams. So this team of learners had to start and learn and a difficult journey of directing their own learning. But it was also transformative. We wanted them to really look critically at their own views and their own experiences of leadership and build on that so that it was actually became more from them, and they passed a point of no return. So that actually they transformed in that learning journey. The next tick, please. So we had no preset or predetermined course material, which was quite for lecturers, you know, we're not going to be delivering stuff. We're actually having to work alongside and build learning relationships and respect the unicity of the students, plus their own right to self-determination. Where they wanted to go and explore more, we would accompany them and help them explore that. So the next tip, please. And this was quite uncomfortable for them. And this is where the person-centered relationship is not always hunky-dory. And you have to move through these movements and these uncomfortable situations to come out on the other side. And we often heard, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know what you're expecting. Tell me what to do and I'll do it. And we didn't really give straight, simple answers to those questions. We encouraged them to look deeper and discuss with each other and find ways of moving forward. The next tip, please. So the emphasis was on the developing their own vision of good leadership, but there were more similarities than differences. But they were being fed through their reading, the reflecting of their own experiences, plus the experiences of others, and of gathering feedback on their own performance. Next tip, please. And those were the key questions. Was how do you define leadership in a nutshell, because that's also very difficult, and especially in their own words. What are your core values? Because we know that core values were a strong influence on behavior and the way we think and the way we act. And how is that pan out in your leadership? And what does it look like in your practice? So they were gathering evidence around their own leadership practice, and they still are. Another tip, please. So at the end, it all turned out well. And what we often hear as people graduate from the program is that they are especially going to miss the leadership learning sessions, because they're going to miss that when they go back into practice and they're no longer enrolled in the university. So that's set us in new ideas with our new knowledge centre on person-centeredness in an ageing society, and there's two focus on leadership and technology. Can we start to create communities of practice to keep this generative exploration of what leadership and what person-centered leadership can mean, and what influence it can have on our healthcare cultures in today's society? The next one, please. And I think now it's time to go over to Helen, because she's doing some really interesting work now with her own PhD that she's in her last year at the moment. And we're all desperately waiting until the whole thesis is ready and we can really study it in detail. But she's going to lead us through what works for whom and in what circumstances. So really, it's over to you, Helen.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Helen. Thank you.
Okay.
Just before you start, Helen, I've asked the audience if they're okay for us to continue until 1:15, because we are a bit short on time. So we're going to continue until 1:15 and then make the recording available to people after that.
Lovely. Okay. Well, hopefully it won't be too long. Okay. I just wanted to say it's a privilege to be here, and thank you for asking me to contribute. And hopefully this section will build very nicely on Sean's presentation, which I really understand a lot more now. It's quite a detailed thing, but lovely presentation there, and lots of links, I'm sure. So this program that I've looked at is about a realist evaluation of a clinical leadership program across the hospital trust in the southeast of England. And the background really simply was that clinical leadership has a key role to play, as we all know, in quality patient care and quality improvement. But there's little robust evidence on the role that these sorts of programs can play in transforming the organisational culture. So this was focused on looking at individuals and teams, particularly at the front line, and exploring what works for whom and in what circumstances. And also importantly, what doesn't work, which is an under-researched area in realist evaluation. So I was looking to see what does make a difference to effective workplace cultures and person-centered clinical leadership practice. And I'll take the clinical in further with Sean afterwards, because his PhD's got clinical in brackets. I've got a copy of it sat on my shelf, so we can debate that. So next slide, please. So the case study that I did generated 2 program theories that were synthesized into 6 simple rules, and these are adapted from a large-scale transformational realist evaluation across London, and they captured the essence of what clinical leadership programs and strategies work and why they work. So they're an easier way of understanding the sort of realist principles, if you like. So investing time and support to explore values and beliefs enables greater self-awareness, optimism and value of the clinical leadership role, alongside an organisation with a shared vision and strong driving force for practice development and culture change. Interprofessional education strategies build interdisciplinary relationships with outcomes of improved team building, collaboration and interprofessional learning. Enabling learning in the workplace and experiential learning happens with expert facilitation and critical companionship, which helps the clinical leader focus on their personal and professional development. I think that links interestingly with this focus that Sean talked about of coming into their own, and the focus more on the self. When clinicians get involved in change and focus on service improvement, they become interventions orientated, leading to better care, safety and quality. So I think that's about being allowed to take charge and take these initiatives forward. And fostering a transformational leadership behaviours enables the leader to become re-energised and clarify their role and become a transformative leader in clinical practice, with outcomes of things like improved motivation, retention and recruitment. And that's really important at this stage, in nationally and internationally. And linking finally to the organisational objectives, and that's through undertaking a bespoke programme that involves the clinicians in design and teaching and increase.
I think we might have lost your sound, Helen.
Helen, can you put your microphone back on?
Unmute.
Ah, yeah.
Have you lost all of that? Shall I move on to the next bit? Can I have the next slide, please? So this slide will explain a new framework that's the sort of core of my study, that considers the paradoxes for clinical leaders in what works and what doesn't work, and how this impacts on effective workplace culture and person-centered clinical leadership in practice. So from the beginning, a paradox became evident from the first focus group that I attended, where these contradictions of the impact of the programme experience and unexpected outcomes raised questions how these clinical leaders could operate and flourish within this setting with seemingly incompatible forces at play. So the framework identified that on one hand, clinical leaders work to achieve flourishing frontline microsystems, whilst on the other struggle with disconnected or unsupportive organisational cultures at the meso level. So the flourishing quadrant there, this built on the simple rules in the last slide, which demonstrates how experiential learning and practice development strategies facilitate clinical leaders to flourish and become part of an engaged culture at the front line. And the clinical leadership programme encouraged the self as the main focus of learning. And interestingly, some people talked about that being a privilege and an indulgement. And utilising practice development strategies enabled others to develop skills in the workplace that contributed to the transformation agenda and culture change. So the programme empowered clinical leaders to feel valued and respected and supported, and offered, as been mentioned, a psychologically safe environment to innovate and improve ways of working and care provision within a climate of trust from their managers, facilitators and mentors. The clinical leaders learned to give and receive feedback and found a renewed sense of teamwork and became involved in decision making with the embedded use of activities that celebrated their contributions and successes, such as the claims, concerns and issues activity, trust awards and achieving clinical excellence recognition and accreditation. So the fractured element, this was about the disconnection and disinvestment that was there. So this became evident in the dissonance between the two levels. And they identified a lack of alignment between the programme and some of the organisational objectives, and tensions between the individual's aims and the organisation. There was no clear educational strategy for leadership, and that caused overlap, wasted resources and frustration from the lack of alignment of the programme alongside the plethora of internal and external leadership education provision available. No one really knew what was the best one for whom. The transformational quadrant, this was evident by the way that the programme underpinned by this experiential learning and critical creative practice development really helped people develop their workplace for learning. And this was heavily influenced by transformational leadership theories such as Cousins and Posner. And the PD principles of collaboration, inclusion and participation really worked towards the development of a critical mass of clinical leaders and workforce facilitators across the professions to take forward the shared purpose and culture change agenda. An interesting angle was the dark side. This was seen where the organisational culture impacted negatively on the students' application of the programme. The focus moved from quality of care to balancing finances and service quality, and causing a lack of person-centredness, and there was some evidence of bullying and harassment. Some participants struggled with experiential learning and reflection, and they didn't all like the critical creative practice development approaches. Clinical commitments and time constraints impeded a lot of their work-based learning activities, and some staff were left with the paradoxical situation of studying clinical leadership without being culturally allowed to implement or consolidate their learning. So there were challenges for the support roles too. Too many new facilitators at one time, different messages, disadvantage of the facilitators being known to participants, and a lack of confidence with facilitating medical consultants. So the dark side of the transformational leadership, participants got caught up in this with hubris and hierarchical power differentials, and dissenting opinions were marginalised, and that undermined their psychological safety and ability to speak up, and upward communication became more flattery than critical decision making. And there were some defensive behaviours evident, with a passive approach to avoiding action, such as low response to the staff survey, low morale, high attrition, high vacancy factor, consultants disengagement, and poor attendance at action learning sets. So to conclude, clinical leaders aspire to leadership as a notable pursuit, applying principles of practice development and transformational leadership, whilst they navigate through the dark side. And consciousness of these paradoxes and pitfalls, addressed through self-awareness and commitment to values-based and collective leadership, is part of the journey towards flourishing frontline teams. And now I'll hand over to Kim, who's going to talk about a recent study to identify about relational leadership processes and strategies used by a range of health professions, using the metaphor of guiding lights rather than the simple rules that I've built on.
Thank you, Helen and Sean. There will be links. Please do have you, because that's lovely. This study is how to strengthen nursing within allied leadership in all contexts. These contexts include practice, education, research, and strategy. And it involved, like Helen's study, a realist evaluation, but also an appreciative to interrogate the literature, to generate some tentative theories about how to answer that question in terms of those leadership contexts. It was a study that involved colleagues across the UK, in the University of West of Scotland, Belinda Dewar, colleagues in Bangor, and in University of Ulster. So it's a UK study. Following on from the interrogation of the literature and the generation of some tentative theories that answer that question, we then further refined those theories in two ways. First, by holding workshops in all of the countries of the UK with nurses, midwives and AHPs who had been nominated and recognised as leaders through a Twitter chat. And the Twitter chat also helped us to understand and refine the theories and to use language that was more accessible. So moving on to the next slide, one of the outputs on the next slide was 5 guiding lights. These 5 guiding lights seem simple, but actually they've been generated from a very complex and detailed process of analysis of the data. So these 5 guiding lights set out really to explain in the simplest way possible a relationship and person-centered approach to leadership by just remembering what the guiding lights are about based on the light metaphor. We use the word guiding lights because it's much more flexible than the concept of simple rules and recognizes how leaders need to work with context in a flexible way. So the first guiding light focuses on identifying the light between us in our interactions, the things that we share, our values, our passions. The second guiding light is about seeing people's inner light, what it is that drives them, what it is that matters to them. The third guiding light, for me, I think is one of the more difficult to achieve. It's about kindling the spark of light in others. I think that's easier to do, but it's the second part that's harder. It's the keeping it glowing over all the challenges that we experience on a day-to-day basis. The fourth guiding light is about managing uncertainty, managing those things that come left field. So it's about lighting up the known and the yet to be known, and the yet to be known reflects the unpredictable nature of the context and work that we work in. And it's really about conveying that stability and shared values that help us to remain calm and steady when we're thrown by things that are unpredictable. The last guiding light is recognizing that none of us can be experts in everything. And that's where the concept of followers and leaders for me comes in, because we are constellations of connected stars that can complement each other. And so the importance of developing those constellations and those connections through our networks helps us to contribute to social capital, the wealth that we can all draw on from each other. So those guiding lights were the main output of this study, and we can direct you to much more detail about it. On the next slide was a second output. There were a number of outputs, but we've just chosen to share these two. So this second output was an impact framework that we developed. And this is just an example of the impacts linked to Guiding Light 1 and Guiding Light 2. But you will notice they are at 3 different levels: self, team, and communities. And the communities could well be systems focused as well. Now, this sort of resource can be used to evidence impact, for example, in portfolios, for academic accreditation or for role development. It can be used to gather feedback about progress as one gains more and more feedback from others about how we are progressing. And it can be used to demonstrate the impact of good relationship-based leadership on teams and services and communities, which in turn can demonstrate research on investment for leadership development, something that is greatly lacking, and also the importance of leadership's impact on staff well-being and retention that we need commissioners to understand. So that takes us on, I think, now to Carrie and Sean to talk about collective leadership.
Thank you very much, Kim. Can I have the next slide, please, Rebecca? We're very grateful to people staying on. I'm just going to gloss over this quite quickly because we've only got 5 minutes left. But we will pick this theme up again in our next webinar series. So we wanted to just share an example of a piece of work that we've done around developing collective leadership in teams. Next slide, please. With primary care networks in the southeast of England. And we worked with Kent and Medway Commissioning Group and the Institute for Medical Sciences at Canterbury Christchurch University to evaluate a collective leadership programme that was run over 8 months for 2 cohorts of 16 GP practices and their primary care network teams through a series of masterclasses, peer consulting and action learning sessions. And we undertook the process evaluation with them. And the impact evaluation focused on trying to identify what impact the programme had on individual participants in their leadership practice, what impact it had on their teams, practices and workplace, and what learning and development processes had been most influential. This paper is actually just about to be published, so the reference is at the bottom of the slide, but this is an example of a co-created leadership impact framework which was developed with participants during the programme that identified for them what their enabling factors for effective leadership were, looking at individual, team and organisational system enablers. How would they recognise it was actually happening at different levels of the system, and the consequences and outcomes for individuals, teams and the wider service. And the strategies that worked were that this framework was used as a self-assessment tool by participants to enable them to map their leadership journey from the beginning of the programme, at midpoint and at the end. And that was work used in collaboration with a reflective review tool. And we were able to co-create a leadership impact continuum which enabled people to map their journey from change starts with me all the way through to wider impact on teams and systems. And so you can read all about the outcomes and output from that study in the publication at the bottom. So if we just go to next slide, please. We used a number of different strategies in that programme, which included high challenge and high support. So here's an example of the high challenge, high support matrix, which enabled teams to identify how supportive and challenging conversations were with each other, and enables people to move from areas of a weakness to areas of strength, which are really important in terms of giving and receiving feedback in high performing teams. And they also used a values clarification activity to develop shared purpose around team functioning, which was very beneficial. Next slide, please. I'm going to point you to the leadership impact journey that Ian Felstead has shared with us. And that's available also through the live tweet today. So the Twitter chat, if you go to hashtag leadership goals, you'll be able to see that. And we'll also put that on our YouTube and website. It's about 15 minutes worth of Ian talking about how he's moved from working as an individual leader through to a systems leader, and some of the research and development that he's undertaken with us during that journey. And I'm very aware of time, Kim, so I think we'll have to come back to the systems leadership slides at another point in our next series, if that's all right.
Absolutely fine.
So Rebecca, if we just go to the conclusion slide, please, if you wouldn't mind. So I suppose in conclusion, first of all, I'd like to say a massive thank you to both Sean, Helen, Kim, Sally and Jonathan, Heather and Rebecca, and all of our audience for your patience and for staying with us on this journey. The thing that we really want to get across is that the leadership development and leadership journey has to be multi-level and multi-dimensional. And we have to be thinking about how we evidence impact when we're talking about systems transformation. And it's really important that we find ways to develop capacity and capability across the workforce. So in our next series, we will be identifying practical strategies about how to do that. And in part, that does need us to develop more joint clinical systems leadership posts and embedded researcher posts that are able to facilitate complexity and embed sustainable change. And it is important that we move people away from thinking in silos to thinking about single integrated multi-professional career development frameworks. And the consultant practitioner and advanced practitioner frameworks developed in collaboration with Health Education England are really good examples of that, soon to be published. So without further ado, thank you everybody for your patience. I apologise, we've got no time to ask questions, but you can join me shortly on Twitter to further the conversation, and I will be available until 2 o'clock. You can contact us through Twitter, but also through our email addresses here, and the links to watching Ian's film is available on this slide. And then there are 2 slides at the end which provide the references for the session today. So without further ado, thank you very much, everybody. And I don't know if my colleagues want to make a final comment. Sean, Helen, Kim, would you like to say anything?
Thank you for the opportunity. And I hope people have enjoyed their supersonic fly-through leadership at different levels, different dimensions, from the individual to the collective. But I think if we've instigated people into a thinking mode and take back and have conversations in their own settings with their own teams, then I think we've achieved a great deal today.
Thank you, Sean, Helen, and Kim.
Yes, I'd echo that, and thank you for the opportunity as well, because it's always helpful when you're on these courses. I'd just like to say, I think I think some of us have been asked to contribute to your next series, so I think we'll have time then to unpack things in more detail and explain the tools that we've used, etc. So
thank you, Helen.
Yeah, I'm going to go on the Twitter chat if anyone's got any.
Thank you. That's great. Kim, did you want to say anything?
Just to say thank you to all our participants for staying with us. Thank you. We do value that.
And Sally and Jonathan, I wondered if there were any points that you wanted to highlight. No.
I suppose all I was going to say, Carrie, is that leadership is all our roles, and that is really key. That we all absolutely have a part to play in the leadership journey and supporting others.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think there's some interesting questions in the chat, most of which we can answer through the Twitter chat, but we might just do a bit of feedback on that as well. So can I just say thank you to everybody, to Heather, Rebecca and Bianca, as ever, for your hard work and determination in bringing it all together. And thank you to our audience and to our team. I think collectively, we've tried to model the way in terms of collective leadership. But we had a massive agenda. So thanks very much, everybody.